Welcome, students, faculty, and sundry others. My name is Ben Waller. As chair of the Department of Languages and Literatures at Hastings College, it is my pleasure today to introduce our honored speaker, Dr. Antje Anderson. Although this is her last semester at the college, Dr. Anderson does not stop. She has never stopped. And as you will hear in this talk, she will never stop. Oh, this talk may come to an end before the hour is up, which will be a feat considering it began its life at 30-some pages, but has been significantly trimmed since then. So, this talk will end, but don't think for a moment that this is any kind of conclusion for Dr. Anderson. Let me explain a minute what I mean about Antje never stopping. If you are ever her student, you will know the lengths she goes to in explaining an assignment to you, in discussing a project with you as you work on it, and in commenting on the work you have turned into her. If Antje was ever your advisor, you will know that she will never stop with planning just the next semester. Your whole 4 years will be plotted out the moment you first step into her office. If Antje was ever your supervisor, as she was mine for many years, you will never have lacked guidance, mentorship, and direction. And if Antje was ever your colleague, you will know she never shirked a committee responsibility or left unresolved a project. If you have ever sat beside Antje for a lecture or a meeting, you will know that the piece of paper in her lap will be entirely filled with the most intricate and artful doodling you have ever seen. If you ever opposed Antje in a debate, you know she does not relent, at least when pursuing a passion. She does not give up until her goals are achieved. This is all to say that in my experience working with her for more than a decade now, I have found her to be the most committed, thorough, and passionate person I've ever known. I will stop now so that you can witness some of that passion for yourselves. Therefore, I give you the unstoppable Antje Anderson.
Good morning. Thank you, Ben. And thank you also, while I'm at it, to all of these people on here. Thank you, and thank you again. And a special shout out to the members of the George Eliot Club of Hastings who are here today. I only learned very recently about the club, which was founded in 1889, and it is Nebraska's oldest women's study group. It makes me so happy that you're here, even though I think I won't tell you much that you don't already know. So I apologize in advance. Okay. I also want to thank, more than anything, the teachers of literature that are in the audience. So I would ask that current and former teachers who build reading and literary works into their classrooms in any form, please stand up so that we can honor you. Thank you. At whatever level you teach or taught, and however you build reading into your teaching, and if some of the kids in your classes walk away with a lasting love of stories, poems, or plays, that's a tremendous gift to them and to all of us, and it lasts a lifetime. I will forever be grateful to the educators and scholars who, from my first grade teacher to my colleagues today, have reinforced my passion for reading and my love for the beauty and the power of words. Thank you. Last but not least, thank you all for coming today. If you voted for me to give the invited faculty lecture this spring, I feel both honored and humbled by your vote. I know that many of you are here because you're curious about this talk. Well, maybe, sort of, kind of. But you may have ended up here because because of the lure of extra credit, or because someone obnoxious like Dr. Anderson has required you to be here. So I hope you will also be interested by the end of this And I hope that I can stop everyone from sending boredom emojis from the phones in their laps. Maybe there shouldn't be any phones in labs? I don't know. Okay. All right. Let's start with love. Since the one thing you all already know about this talk from the title is that I love George. I'll tell you more about my love for George until you won't be sure whether this is just a fling, true and lasting affection, or a complete obsession. But one thing is for sure, it is unrequited. I love George, but George never even knew I exist. That's because George Eliot, famous British novelist, died in 1880. But when it comes to loving your favorite writer, it is luckily not a problem. You always feel that the beloved understands you and speaks to you through his or her writing, even though he or she never met you. You can love across the centuries and across vast distances. You can leave and come back many times. Most relationship rules don't apply. You don't have to be monogamous. I am definitely not book monogamous. I have loved many writers over time and many simultaneously. Needless to say, sexual orientation and gender identity also are irrelevant. And as you can see, despite her name, George Eliot is a woman, and her real name was Marian Evans. She wrote under the male pen name George Eliot, and I love her as George and as Marian. She had one of the most beautiful minds and one of the most amazing gifts for storytelling in all of literature, and that's why I love her. What you will hear then today is how I first fell for George, and how even though we've been a bit off again, on again, I always return to her, to the novels and the life story of this awesome 19th century novelist. And you know how it is with love stories. All you have to do is lend me your ears. But you're not required to fall in love with her yourself. You can feel superior and think I'm totally ridiculous to be so smitten. But if you decide to get to know George better, and you do develop a crush, there's an additional advantage to a book lover's love. I won't be jealous at all. I'll share. So here is where my story begins. With a sip of water, actually. In college. A long, long time ago, in a galaxy, well, actually just a country far, far away, I attended the University of Hamburg in Germany to study literature. As many of you know, I grew up there. Thanks to an amazing German teacher. Remember, that's the equivalent of the amazing English teacher you had in high school if you were lucky. For example, if you had Honey Lou. I had discovered in 11th grade that one could actually attend a university with the sole purpose of studying literature. And I knew right away that I had found what I wanted to do with my life. True story. I was a voracious reader who already loved analyzing classic novels, and here was the career for me. I was going to be a professor of literature. And literature in English, a language which I had been learning since 5th grade, was absolutely going to be front and center in this endeavor. I was obsessed with England and already a sucker for a hodgepodge of British fiction, which, by the way, at the time included The Secret Garden, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and The Lord of the Rings. So the range was pretty broad. So in my second year at the University of Hamburg, in the spring of 1987, at the tender age of 21, I took my first upper-level lit class, which was to cover 2 Victorian novels, Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray and Middlemarch by George Eliot. It was my first time for reading either. And those are actually the books I read, those editions. I still have my notes from this class, and I know I learned a lot, including basic biographical info about George. And so here's a thumbnail sketch up front. Think of it as the online dating profile I read before I gave her a try. George Eliot was born in the British Midlands in Warwickshire in 1819 as Mary Ann Evans, and lived a very quiet country life into her late 20s, taking care of her father after her mother had died when she was 17. She was highly intelligent and had had more formal schooling than most girls, but after leaving the equivalent of a girls' boarding school at age 16, there was no way for her as a woman to go further with her education, except by reading a lot and starting to write a little. Her life took off when her father died in 1849. She was 30, and she made the very bold decision to first travel independently around Europe and then move to London all on her own. She befriended the editor of a literary journal, the Westminster Review, and became, for all intents and purposes, both the main editor of this journal and a major contributor to it, even though all her contributions were anonymous and uncredited at the time. In the mid-1850s, she began to write fiction under the male pen name George Eliot, so that at first no one knew who was writing the stories. Side note, writing under a male pseudonym was fairly common for women at the time. The Bronte sisters did it, as did the French writer George Sand. But importantly, it wasn't because it was unheard of for women to be writers. There were also many women writers who published under their real names. But there was a widespread prejudice that women novelists wrote mostly sappy trash and couldn't be taken seriously. And even George Eliot herself shared that prejudice and famously wrote a scathing review called Silly Novels by Lady Novelists before starting to write her own novels. That has sort of come back to haunt her in scholarship. When her early stories, The Scenes of Clerical Life, were written, readers from all over England were riveted by her complex, realistic portraits of people from the British Midlands, and her career as a fiction writer took off. By the time her first novel, Adam Bede, came out in book form in 1859, her true identity was actually known, just so that you don't think she sort of walked through life being able to hide herself behind this male pseudonym. She didn't. When she died in 1880, at the age of 61, she had become internationally famous, and she is still considered one of the best British novelists of all times. She wrote 6 novels, a number of shorter stories, and also some long poems, which, I'm sorry to say, are pretty atrocious. She was not a talented poet. That said, as I was about to find out in my class, she was a fantastic novelist, and Middlemarch, her best novel, was a great way to show me that she was good literary dating material. Maybe this is not your experience, but falling in love in college is probably 80% about yourself and 20% about the person you fall in love with. I think that's the reason that the only thing I remember with clarity about the class and about my budding relationship with George is about me and my own personal crisis. In this case, the crisis was that I struggled mightily with the paper I had to write for the class. I wanted to compare our 2 novels' heroines, Amelia Sedley in Vanity Fair and Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch, as Victorian wives and widows. This, I believe, was a prefab topic from the list the professor handed out. But I really didn't know how to get started. I had never had a project like this before with independent research. Plus, there was no internet. I will leave it to your imagination what that meant, because even those of you who are as old as I am and are now wondering how we possibly ever did research with books only. Also, I felt like I was all alone with my paper because we had basically no guidance on our writing. No drafts with feedback, no peer review, no writing workshops. So I spent a lot of the paper summarizing what I found out about Victorian women from the books in the university library. When I finally got around to comparing the 2 characters as wives and widows, I had sort of forgotten that I needed a thesis. Needless to say, the resulting paper was way too long and quite awful. I know, because I still have a copy with the professor's comments. He was rather kind, I think, to give me a B. But he did. And I'm still trading Christmas emails with him, so I think he's forgotten about this. But then the paper was turned in, the class was done, and the upshot was that I had gotten a good introduction to the Victorian novel and an idea of how Victorian women were seen. Dorothea Brooke, the heroine of Middlemarch, had joined the ranks of my favorite literary characters, memorable to me for her smarts, for her reputation as a bit of an oddity among her friends, and for her aspirations to do good, even as her world would only allow her one career choice: marriage to a man of her own social class. One of the running themes of Middlemarch is a comparison of the women in the novel to Saint Teresa of Avila, 16th century founder of an important religious order for women. And Dorothea becomes an example of a 19th century woman who would love to do something important and meaningful like that, but cannot. As George Eliot put it in her preface, here and there is born a Saint Teresa, foundress of nothing, whose loving heartbeats and sobs after an unattained goodness tremble off and are dispersed among hindrances, instead of centering in some long recognizable deed. And as a little shout out to Bill Beachley, where is he? There are also some male characters who fall into this category of Latter-day Saint Teresas, and one of them is Tertius Lydgate, I have him right here, of Middlemarch, who is a male version of that Latter-day Saint Teresa, the new doctor in town with ambitions to make discoveries about basically cell biology, but who gets sort of ground up in his daily routines and petty rivalries. So it's not all just about the women, and he wanted a hook in for his students to get the anatomy people in here. So instead, we're going to talk more about Dorothea, and Tertius will not be in the lecture again. Okay. So Dorothea is such a latter-day Saint Teresa, a foundress of nothing, both as a young unmarried woman and then as a wife and widow of an old and self-absorbed husband. His name? Anyone? Say it. Yes, Casaubon, or I learned it from my professor in Hamburg, Casaubon. So there's apparently a fight going on about the Casaubon, but Mr. Casaubon is the husband. Even later in her life, after remarrying, she never makes any of her great plans a reality. The novel ends with a beautiful and moving tribute to Dorothea's nearly invisible social impact during her life. Her full nature spent itself in channels which had no great name on the earth. But the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive, for the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. This final sentence of Middlemarch, which was ranked among the top 100 novel endings by American Book Review in the 2000s, so pretty recently, is definitely among my top 5 novel endings. What I see here is an incisive commentary on what women, especially women, often experience when their dream careers don't become realities or their high aspirations are quashed by circumstance. It is a consolation that they still do so much good with their unhistoric acts, for you and me, as George puts it. But still, it is a little sad that they die forgotten and remain unvisited after death. But this ending didn't strike me with the force that it has for me today when I first read it in my early 20s. Because back then I thought that Victorian attitudes towards women were ridiculously outdated. It was 1987, 30 years ago. And the idea that women could be considered too smart for their own good and that their career choices could be limited by expectations about marriage and family was ridiculous to me. Total gender equality was in place. Yes, that was a joke. But I really didn't know any better at the time. The world was my oyster. Okay. Well, even though I thought that a long stretch of history with enormous progress toward gender equality divided me from Dorothea and from her creator, I was at least a little bit in love with both of them. I had enjoyed George's company very much while the semester lasted, but as I said earlier, I was pretty self-absorbed and also a bit flighty in my affections. So it was a brief fling. I was too immature to see that George had so much more to offer than what I could get from just a few weeks of casual dating, with some admittedly passionate moments. We had a classic college flirtation. I moved on from it and kept exploring. But since literary love has slightly different rules, we didn't have a traumatic breakup, and George turned out to be very forgiving. When I came back, love struck all over again about 6 years later. In grad school. Okay. After I'd completed my master's degree in Hamburg, I decided I wanted to continue graduate school in the US, still totally determined to become a professor of literature. But I didn't really think I'd revisit Victorian literature. I was interested in postmodern fiction and in narrative theory. But then as I started at Rice, as a doctoral student in the fall of 1991, I worked as a teaching and research assistant for two amazing experts. There we go. Two amazing experts in Victorian literature, Bob Patton and Helena Mickey. And you can look up their mind-boggling scholarly credentials online if you want to. Because of them, I got roped back into George Eliot territory. Remember that class I took in Hamburg on two Victorian novelists, on Eliot and Thackeray? Well, I took another two-author class at Rice with Helena Mickey, this time on George Eliot and Anthony Trollope. But we didn't read two novels, we read 11. And they are the center row there by the daffodils. Okay. You can see them there lined up on my show table, which you should check out at the end. And as I read 5 of Eliot's 6 novels for the class, I fell in love all over again. I have to admit that this reboot of our romance was still partly about me, even in grad school at the ripe old age of 27. My renewed attraction had to do with discovering that George loved and understood German literature, and so did I. It turned out that she knew German very well, had translated 2 major philosophical works from German to English in the 1840s before she even wrote her first novel, and that beginning in 1855, she began to travel regularly to German-speaking countries. She was very well read in German literature and a big fan of world-famous writers like Goethe and Heine. And those of you who took Western Lit 2 with me should remember those two. Here they are. And I was intrigued, not just because I'm German, that would be sort of too easy, but because I had a background in German literature myself. I had a master's degree that I'd gotten in the US while I was still studying in Hamburg, so it's a complicated story. I wrote about the way so this newly discovered love of German literature that George had, I tried to now integrate into my paper that I wrote for Helena Mickey's course. I wrote about the way George's novels reshaped the coming-of-age novel, a genre that originated in Germany as the Bildungsroman with that guy, Goethe. Just for the record, the paper was still a bit of a ramble, but it was better than my undergraduate attempts. It's just still way long. Even though it was long, though, a lot of ideas and questions about George and the Germans ended up on the cutting room floor. But the German connection brought George and me a lot closer. You know how you sort of build a bubble with a person you love when you stop being casual and really get to know each other? That's how I felt when I discovered that we both loved the German books. They were our song. We were soulmates. But alas, you can already predict this. I began to neglect George again. I didn't make her a priority. You could say we became a more permanent thing, but in a very background sort of way. George and her novels stayed home, or rather on my bookshelf, while I turned to much sexier books. Literally, I had decided to write my dissertation about how novelists in the 18th and 19th centuries wrote about women's first sexual experiences, mostly without actually writing about it. And I didn't even make George Eliot part of the plan for that dissertation. Then, when that was done, I was going to come back around to spending time with her, but instead I totally ghosted her. While my life took the crazy twists and turns that are standard for a female academic. I passed my comps at Rice, I got married, I started my dissertation, I had a baby, I moved to Pennsylvania to start working full-time as a college instructor, I finished my dissertation, I moved to Nebraska with only an adjunct job, had another baby, got a full-time position at Hastings, and got swept up in juggling a life of teaching college and raising kids. And I take great pride in the fact that after a divorce, I did that as a single working mother for about 10 years. And it was hard. Okay. Yay. Rock it. I'd like to think that if George had known me, she would have been very patient with me as I tried to figure out my priorities. She always understood so well how women are pulled into many different directions by their lives, struggling to make room for everything and juggling complicated life situations. She would have appreciated my thirst for knowledge and my dedication to pass that knowledge on through teaching. At least that's what I think, based on the way she describes the lives of the female characters in her novels that long to have an education and to be socially useful to others, like Dorothea from Middlemarch and many others. I'm mentioning some good friends to some of you, Dinah Morris and Adam Bede, Maggie Tulliver in Mill on the Floss. Time and again, George's novels feature female characters who showcase how hard it was for women with a thirst for learning and a sense of a mission to make their mark in public in an era that limited women to the private sphere, to house and home. In the way she describes these characters, you can tell how much empathy she has for them, so I like to think she would have made some allowances for me. But there's another facet to why she wouldn't have minded being ghosted by me. It's not like I was her main squeeze. She had someone much more loyal and devoted to focus on. She had her own George, whom she loved, and who deserved it way more than I did. This George Henry Lewis was his name, was so clearly the love of her life and vice versa that I can't even be jealous. I'm just happy for them, and their story is one of my favorite love stories of all time. I can't do it justice here, so if you want to know more about it, read the chapter on George Eliot and George Henry Lewis in Phyllis Roses's book, Parallel Lives. But here's the 2-minute version. In 1851, when George Eliot was still Marian Evans, the anonymous editor and reviewer for the Westminster Review, she met George Henry Lewis. She was in her early 30s, and it made her life take a dramatic turn. George Henry was a leading intellectual and science writer at the time and regularly contributed to the Westminster Review. He had long been separated from his wife Agnes, who was involved with another man and had several children by that other man. But for a number of complicated reasons that you're welcome to ask me about, he could not divorce her. So when George Henry and Marian became a couple in 1855, they knew that they could not get married. Instead, they ran away. They spent about 6 months in Germany, where George Henry did research for his biography of Goethe, and Marian brushed up on her fairly bad conversational German. When they came back to England, they moved in together and referred to themselves as husband and wife. Marian called herself Mrs. Lewis from then on out. But George and George made this bold decision at a tremendous cost. London society knew that Mrs. Lewis was a fiction and was scandalized. Her family broke off contact with her because she was living in sin, and for decades, until George Eliot became so famous, proper etiquette didn't matter anymore. The wives of their friends refused to visit George Eliot or invite her over to their homes. Given the Victorian double standard, only George Eliot was shunned. George Henry could be invited to dinner, and they could invite his guy friends to their house without their wives. Okay. Occasionally, and very obviously, this really stung. But George Eliot ended not caring that much about it because her writing began to absorb all of her time. Starting after the 1855 elopement, George Henry Lewis strongly encouraged her to try writing fiction. Even though he remained a prolific writer himself, he became basically her manager and agent, and the two Georges lived together happily and productively for a total of 23 years until George Henry's death in 1878, which left George Eliot devastated. In their years together, George and George worked on their writing side by side, traveled all over Europe, had fun with botany and marine biology, and art museums and spas, and they read many, many books together at night in bed. He obviously read to her every night, and then he wrote it down in his journal, so scholars are forever grateful because we know exactly what they read. It's amazing. Okay. What made their relationship so remarkable is that he supported her as a writer without reservations. Admittedly, he was probably a bit of a helicopter husband, definitely overprotective in the way when it came to shielding her from the critics, but they were very fiercely egalitarian in the way they treated each other as intellectual equals and writing partners, and they were clearly devoted to one another. So the upshot for me was that I was never going to be all that important to my beloved novelist. And that made it seem okay that I, on my hand, had put her on the back burner for so long. But then I did come back. And this time, I was in it for the long haul. And I was going to be much, much more loyal. There we go. And maybe just a little obsessive, even though, again, when it comes to literary romance, reading everything about your beloved's life, including her private journals, her letters, and her notebooks, is not considered creepy, but good scholarship. My new commitment to George started with a deceptively simple question about a German novel. Had George read it? A minor research project had popped up in my life in 2002 concerning a not-so-famous German novel from 1855 called Soll und Haben, or in English, and the rest of this will always be in English, I promise, Debiting Credit, which seemed to have many unexpected connections to British fiction. I researched many of these connections for several years, and eventually I asked myself, had George Eliot read that novel? Maybe on her first trip to Germany with George Henry in 1855, right when that novel came out? Now I have to step back a little, because it won't make any sense to you why this became such a key question, or why this brought me so much closer to George. Yes, the question took me back to the German connection between George and me. But there was more. I wanted to know whether George had read Debiting Credit because she had written her last novel, Daniel Deronda, explicitly to combat anti-Jewish prejudice. And I'm not reading, you can read this while you're listening to me. I know you can double task. Okay. This had become a major mission of hers in the last decade of her life. And Debiting Credit, that German novel, featured some very nasty anti-Semitic portraits of a greedy Jewish merchant and his villainous apprentice. So I wondered, did she write Daniel Deronda partly in response to reading a German novel full of anti-Jewish prejudice? I wanted to find the answer, and in the process, I became completely obsessed with finding out everything about George's reading habits, especially about what German and German Jewish writers she had read and studied. During my sabbatical, my research leave, in the spring of 2010, I was basically living, breathing, and thinking about nothing but George and the writers she had possibly read. I was in Germany and able to do some of my research on site, but I did spend quite a bit of time just holed up with George and her writings and like all of those books. Yeah. So I got to know her incredibly well, and I got very excited about the scholarship that's out there, including, and that book is sort of at the center of this table, a book that lists patiently every single German book that Eliot had ever read. It still blows my mind that somebody sat down and put that together, but it's over there, and you can see it. And yet, all my snooping resulted in a rather disappointing answer to my original question about Debiting Credit and Daniel Deronda. It turns out that George did not write her novel in direct response to Debiting Credit and its anti-Semitism, even though she owned a copy of the novel, and even though she actually read it. Here's what I found out. Number one, Eliot didn't read Debiting Credit when it first came out. She hadn't read it by October 1857, and we have a letter to tell us that. Number two, frustratingly, George Henry did read it in 1858, and he reviewed it in a magazine. So we know he read it. He had snarky things to say about Debiting Credit. But it is impossible to prove that George Eliot read it as well when the review copy was lying around in their hotel rooms. Frustratingly, she never mentions it, and neither does he. Number three, the two of them did read it together. I was excited, but it was not until 1876, and at that time, Eliot had already completed Daniel Deronda, so that the reading of the book could not have influenced her as she conceived the idea for the novel. And number four, even worse for me, at no point do either George Eliot or George Henry take special note of the anti-Jewish bias of the novel at all. It's like they didn't even see it, so didn't help. Okay, so was I heartbroken when I had painstakingly found out that this novel was unlikely to have influenced her? Was I going to walk out on this unrewarding relationship? Of course not. Because along the way, I not only realized that there were always new things to discover about George and that my relationship with her would never become boring, the process also opened my world and broadened my horizons, like a good long-term relationship should. As you do when you become truly committed to someone, I now met all her friends and family, so to speak. Instead of living in a bubble by ourselves, we were in the large and loving company of many others, other authors, other books, other readers, and that meant new discoveries for me. I found out that Eliot, although she didn't read Debiting Credit before she wrote Deronda, did read many other books by and about German Jews. And it became very clear that they did influence her. So I ended up reading and researching several other writers because of George. And even though I now no longer write papers for my courses, I've given about 5 conference papers on this topic, and maybe one day I'll actually publish an article on these findings. I'll give you just one example of a writer I got to know this way, a really interesting early feminist author whom George actually met in person. Her name was Fanny Levitt, and George met her on that all-important first trip to Germany when she was staying in Berlin in 1856. Levitt was German Jewish novelist who also wrote many articles and books on women's rights and women's education. She wrote an amazingly modern-sounding autobiography about the prejudices she encountered growing up Jewish and female in early 19th century Prussia. And Eliot read this autobiography. It was called Meine Lebensgeschichte. You can see that there. And she read it in November of 1870 and February of 1871, and very probably again in September of 1875. Thank you, George Henry. You wrote it all down. In other words, right as she was working on Deronda. I think that George Eliot took some cues from the way that Fanny Levitt addressed a primarily Gentile, that is, non-Jewish audience, as George intended to do in her novel. And she would have noticed how Levitt stressed the tension between the traditional Jewish life of her grandparents with her own life of an assimilated secular Jew, a tension that was to become a major theme in Deronda. Finding out about Fanny Levitt and several other authors that George did actually read as she was working on her last novel ended up being very rewarding. It widened the circle of my literary acquaintances, but it also made me get to know George so much better. Reading George's letters and personal writing made me appreciate how very concerned she was that she wouldn't be able to make her non-Jewish readers empathize with the Jews. And I'm still working out whether, sadly, she was perhaps right, because many Gentile readers in her day did actually dislike the book, or at least the Jewish part, as they often put it, while on the other hand, many Jewish readers praised to the skies for the author's knowledge about and sympathy for the Jews. To me, George's attempt to make her readers understand the tiny Jewish minority in Britain better connects directly to the way she encourages her readers to understand her complex female characters. She was able to make so many readers feel deeply for and with women like Dorothea, Brooke, and Middlemarch. Even in Deronda, there's a major female character, Gwendolyn Harleth, who has triggered the sympathy of many readers, despite the fact that she may have had a hand in her husband's death. But the fact that her critics in the 1870s didn't like the Jewish element of the novel, or its hero, Deronda, shows that it wasn't easy for George to transfer her methods for generating that kind of empathy to her Jewish characters. That's partly because she was so way ahead of her time in trying to do so. One more reason for me to love her as much as I do. I know that I said right at the beginning that George doesn't return my feelings. But I would like to believe that George would be very happy that I'm a bit more constant in my affection for her than I used to be, and that my love for her has broadened my horizon so much, and that it has caused me to ask questions I didn't even know I had. And I think she would be pleased to find out that I have begun to find yet another way to appreciate her even more, as our love is about to enter a new phase. My favorite picture. Okay. Thank you, Mark. Okay. Many of you know, and this is a gulp moment for me, sorry, that I'm leaving Hastings College at the end of this academic year after 19 years of teaching here in order to move to Lincoln. The reason is that as much as I love George, I also love a living human being in real life. We've lived apart for the last 7 years, and we will finally be able to move in together. But I am bringing all my George Eliot books with me when I move, so I guess we'll just have to be polyamorous. So when I move on, one of my key goals, apart from finding ways to still teach literature somehow, is to take more classes myself. Specifically, I want to study art history, which is a field I have always been curious about, but have not ever properly studied. I'm currently taking an online art history course that has me spellbound, and I'm learning so much cool stuff about analyzing visual art. But that doesn't mean I have to leave literary studies behind. Certainly not my beloved George. I have long known that the German connection and the fascination with the question of how to create empathy for characters in novels are not the only things that we have in common. We also share a passion for the visual arts and for art history. When George discovered Greek, Roman, and Renaissance art, again on that very first trip to Germany in 1855, it left a deep impression on her. And being the thorough scholar she was about everything, she studied up on it continuously. She also built references to works of art into many of her novels. For example, she famously imagined Daniel Deronda as looking like a portrait by Titian that she had seen and studied. I cannot wait to explore with new eyes and new knowledge how and where she used the visual arts in her novels. And just to close the circle, I'll leave you with a famous and much quoted passage from Middlemarch, where you can see a glimpse of what cool things George Eliot can do with words to evoke the visual arts. In this passage, Dorothea, my favorite heroine, is first seen by two apparent strangers in the Vatican Museum in Rome, by an artist named Naumann from Germany, German connection, okay, and his friend, Will. Dorothea is on her honeymoon, and this is the first time we as readers get to see her since she got married to Mr. Casaubon, or Mr. Casaubon. Just watch how George is creating an image of Dorothea in contrast to the ancient art that surrounds her, but also as removed from her own time, in which she is just a proper upper-class Englishwoman, newlywed but oddly, with only servants and not her husband for company. Naumann, the German painter, says to his friend, "Come here quick, else she will have changed her pose." Quickness was ready at the call, and the two figures passed lightly along towards the hall where the reclining Ariadne, then called the Cleopatra, lies in marble voluptuousness of her beauty, the drapery folding around her with a petal-like ease and tenderness. They were just in time to see another figure standing against the pedestal near the reclining marble. A breathing, blooming girl whose form, not shamed by the Ariadne, was clad in Quakerish gray drapery. Her long cloak, fastened at the neck, was thrown backward from her arms, and one beautiful ungloved hand pillowed her cheek, pushing somewhat backward the white beaver bonnet, which made a sort of halo to her face around the simply braided dark brown hair. She was not looking at the sculpture, probably not thinking of it. Her large eyes were fixed dreamily on a streak of sunlight which fell across the floor. But she became conscious of the two strangers who suddenly paused as if to contemplate the Cleopatra, and without looking at them, immediately turned away to join a maidservant and a courier who were loitering along the hall at a little distance off. "What do you think of that fine bit of antithesis?" said the German, searching in his friend's face for responding admiration, but going on volubly without waiting for any other answer. "There lies antique beauty, not corpse-like even in death, but arrested in the complete contentment of its sensuous perfection. And here stands beauty in its breathing life, with the consciousness of Christian centuries in its bosom. But she should be dressed as a nun. I think she looks almost what you call a Quaker. I would dress her as a nun in my picture." What I love so much about this passage is how it juxtaposes the real, breathing, blooming girl, Dorothea, with two different works and styles of art. I've tried to show that here with the colors. Dorothea in real life in purple. No, what did I do with the colors? Yes, it's hard to see. Yes, in the purple. Sorry. Is not like the marble statue in the museum in red. She cannot be a larger-than-life monarch on the global stage wielding tremendous power like Cleopatra, or be a famous, clever, and subversive woman from mythology like Ariadne. But she's also not the nun that Naumann, the painter, sees her in. And that's the blue. Sorry. She cannot live unmarried in a community of women with the purpose of doing good in the world. Let's say like Saint Teresa of Avila? Ah, okay. Remember what I said about the importance of Saint Teresa of Avila in Middlemarch? And about Dorothea as a latter-day Saint Teresa, foundress of nothing? George can present this here through words that powerfully evoke visual art, while also forcing us to think about what different viewers in and of the scenes are seeing. Think about it. As we read this passage, we ourselves visualize the scene, which is set in an art museum. That makes the moment pretty meta. But who is seeing what inside the scene makes it even more complicated. Dorothea herself is staring at the floor, and she is pointedly not looking at the statue, whose seductive pose and bare breast would be new and shocking to her. But of course, she cannot see herself in the pose that Naumann so admires, and is not directly conscious of the fact that she looks nun-like with her simple clothes and her natural halo. Oops, I wanted to go back one more time so you can see that. There's the natural halo, right, with the sort of halo. Okay. So, but the painter can see both the living Dorothea in modern dress and the statue, and here it is again, of Cleopatra Ariadne as juxtaposed works of art. And he is eager to turn the breathing, blooming girl into yet another work of art that would take her out of her time. A medieval nun, sort of like this. I'm not even going to talk about the third person in the scene who sees yet another thing, because that's a story for another day. But Naumann's friend Will actually knows Dorothea from England and is surprised and shocked to see her out of context in the Vatican Museum. And like me, as I'm reading her story and seeing the young, unhappy, unfulfilled Dorothea, he's going to fall in love with her. If I were to develop this further with art history in mind, I would look into the actual works of art that are important here, both the marble statue present in the scene, now known as the Weeping Ariadne and still in the Vatican Museum, and some of the romantic representations of nuns in the 19th century, like that nun with the bedroom eyes there on the far side, to show how Naumann could have envisioned Dorothea as a nun. But I hope you got a glimpse of why this is an exciting new way of again staying connected to George and expressing my love for her in yet another way. If what you've just heard from me today strikes you as somewhat self-absorbed, it is. It was a lecture about George Eliot, but even more about the story of my love for her. Neither might have rocked your socks off, and you might leave thinking that the last thing you ever want to do is pick up one of George Eliot's novels. Senior seminar students, you do not have a choice, you have to read it. Okay, starting next week. Okay, if that's the case, what I hope my talk could still do for you is this. Show you that my love for this novelist and her work is real, and encourage you to find a niche, whether it's a research specialty or an area of work, that you love truly, madly, deeply, and tell others about it. Even if you can't get them excited about it, your enthusiasm can show them what I firmly believe is true, that it is possible to love what you do for a living just that much. I hope you can love that thing you do of all things in the world in a lasting and fulfilling way with lifelong affection, but also in a way that allows for the kinds of changes my relationship with George has undergone. That kind of geeky love for what you do can take many forms, and whatever your long-term romance with a subject matter, a topic, a field, or a career might turn out to be, I do hope you find it and live it. Thank you.